Chapter 3, The Delhi Sultans. In Chapter 2, we saw that regions like the Kaveri Delta became the center of large kingdoms. Did you notice that there was no mention of a kingdom with Delhi as its capital? That was because Delhi became an important city only in the 12th century. Take a look at Table 1. Delhi first became the capital of a kingdom under the Tomar Rajputs, who were defeated in the middle of the 12th century by the Chauhans, also referred to as Chahmanas of Ajmer. It was under the Tomars and Chauhans that Delhi became an important commercial center. Many rich Jaina merchants lived in the city and constructed several temples. Coins minted here, called Dehliwal, had a wide circulation. The transformation of Delhi into a capital that controlled vast areas of the subcontinent started with the foundation of the Delhi Sultanate. In the beginning of the 13th century, take a look at Table 1 again and identify the five dynasties that together made the Delhi Sultanate. The Delhi Sultans built many cities in the area that we know now as Delhi. Look at map 1 and locate Delhi, Delhi-e-Kuan, Siri and Jahamana. Finding out about the Delhi Sultans. Although inscriptions, coins, and architecture provide a lot of information, especially valuable are histories. Tariq singular, Tawarik plural, written in Persian, the language of administration under the Delhi Sultans. The authors of Tawarik were learned men, secretaries, administrators, poets, and courtiers who both recounted events and advised rulers on governance, emphasizing the importance of just rule. Keep the following additional details in mind. The authors of Tawarik lived in cities, mainly Delhi, and hardly ever in villages. They often wrote their histories for sultans in the hope of rich rewards. These authors advised rulers on the need to preserve an ideal social order based on birthright and gender distinctions. Their ideas were not shared by everybody. In 1236, Sultan Iltutmish's daughter Razia became sultan. The chronicler of the age, Minhaj-e-Siraj, recognized that she was more able and qualified than all her brothers, but he was not comfortable at having a queen as ruler. Nor were the nobles happy at her attempts to rule independently. She was removed from the throne in 1240. From garrison town to empire, the expansion of the Delhi Sultanate. In the early 13th century, the control of the Delhi Sultans rarely went beyond heavily fortified towns occupied by garrisons. The sultans seldom controlled the hinterland of the cities and were therefore dependent upon trade, tribute, or plunder for supplies. Controlling garrison towns in distant Bengal and Sindh from Delhi was extremely difficult. Rebellion, war, even bad weather could snap fragile communication routes. Delhi's authority was also challenged by Mongol invasions from Afghanistan and by governors who rebelled at any sign of the Sultan's weakness. The Sultanate barely survived these challenges. Its consolidation occurred during the reign of Ghiyasuddin Balban and further expansion under Alauddin Khalji and Muhammad Tughlaq. The first set of campaigns along the internal frontier of the Sultanate aimed at consolidating the hinterlands of the garrison towns. During these campaigns, forests were cleared in the Ganga Yamuna dome and hunter gatherers and pastoralists expelled from their habitat. These lands were given to peasants and agriculture was encouraged. New fortresses, garrison towns, and towns were established to protect trade routes and to promote regional trade. The second expansion occurred along the external frontier of the Sultanate. Military expeditions into the southern India started during the reign of Alauddin Khalji and culminated with Muhammad Tughlaq. In their campaigns, Sultanate armies captured elephants, horses, and slaves and carried away precious metals. By the end of Muhammad Tughlaq's reign, 150 years after somewhat humble beginnings, the armies of the Delhi Sultanate had marched across a large part of the subcontinent. They had defeated rival armies and sieged cities. The Sultanate collected taxes from the peasantry and dispensed justice in its realm. But how complete and effective was its control over such a vast territory? A closer look, administration and consolidation under Khaljis and Tughlaqs. The consolidation of a kingdom as vast as the Delhi Sultanate needed reliable governors and administrators rather than appointing aristocrats and landed chieftains as governors. The early Delhi sultans, especially Iltutmish, favored their special slaves purchased for military service called bandagan in Persian. They were carefully trained to man some of the most important political offices in the kingdom. Since they were totally dependent upon their master, the Sultan could trust and rely upon them. The Khaljis and Tughlaqs continued to use Bandgan and also raised people of humble birth, who were often their clients, to high political positions. They were appointed as generals and governors. However, this also introduced an element of political instability. Slaves and clients were loyal to their masters and patrons, but not to their heirs. New sultans had their own servants. As a result, the accession on of a new monarch often saw conflict between the old and the new nobility. The patronage of these humble people by the sultans also shocked many elites, and the authors of Persian Tawari criticized the Delhi sultans for appointing the low and base born to high offices. Like the earlier sultans, the Khalji and Tughlaq monarchs appointed military commanders as governors of territories of varying sizes. These lands were called Ikta and their holder was called Iktadar or Mukti. The duty of the Muktis was to lead military campaigns and maintain law and order in their Iktas in exchange for their military services. The Muktis collected the revenues of their assignments as salary. They also paid their soldiers from these revenues. Control over Muktis was most effective if their office was not inheritable and if they were assigned iktas for a short period of time before being shifted. These harsh conditions of service were rigorously imposed during the reigns of Alauddin Khalji and Muhammad Tughlaq. Accountants were appointed by the state to check the amount of revenue collected by the muktis. Care was taken that the mukti collected only the taxes prescribed by the state and that he kept the required number of soldiers. As the Delhi sultans brought the hinterland of the cities under their control, they forced the landed chieftains, the Samanta aristocrats, and rich landlords to accept their authority. Under Alauddin Khalji, the state brought the assessment and collection of land revenue under its control. The rights of the local chieftains to levy taxes were cancelled and they were also forced to pay taxes. The Sultan's administrators measured the land and kept careful accounts. Some of the old chieftains and landlords served the Sultanate as revenue collectors and as assessors. There were three types of taxes on cultivation called kharaj and amounting to about 50% of the peasants' produce, on cattle and on houses. It is important to remember that large parts of the subcontinent remained outside the control of the Delhi Sultans. It was difficult to control distant provinces like Bengal from Delhi, and soon after annexing southern India, the entire region became independent. Even in the Gangetic Plain, there were forested areas that the Sultanate forces could not penetrate. Local chieftains established their rule in these regions. Sometimes rulers like Alauddin Khilji and Muhammad Tughlaq could force their control in these areas, but only for a short duration. The Mongols under Genghis Khan invaded Transoxiana in northeast Iran in 1219, and the Delhi Sultanate faced their onslaught soon after. Mongol attacks on the Delhi Sultanate increased during the reign of Alauddin Khilji and in the early years of Muhammad Tughlaq's rule. This forced the two rulers to mobilize a large standing army in Delhi, which posed a huge administrative challenge. Let us see how these two sultans dealt with this. Alauddin Khilji. Delhi was attacked twice in 1299 and 12 and 1300 and 1302 to 1303. As a defensive measure, Alauddin Khilji raised a large standing army. Muhammad Tughlaq. The Sultanate was attacked in the early years of Muhammad Tughlaq's reign. The Mongol army was defeated. Muhammad Tughlaq was confident about the strength of his army and his resources to plan an attack on Transoxiana. He therefore raised a large standing army. Alauddin constructed a new garrison town named Sidi for his soldiers. Rather than constructing a new garrison town, the oldest of the four cities of Delhi, Delhi Iguana, was emptied of its residents and the soldiers garrisoned there. The residents of the old city were sent to the new capital of Daulatabad in the south. The soldiers had to be fed. This was done through the produce collected as tax from lands between the Ganga and Yamuna. Tax was fixed at 50% of the peasant's yield. Produce from the same area was collected as tax to feed the army, but to meet the expenses of maintaining such a large number of soldiers, the Sultan levied additional taxes. This coincided with famine in the area. The soldiers had to pay paid. Alauddin chose to pay his soldiers' salaries in cash rather than iktas. The soldiers would buy their supplies from merchants in Delhi, and it was thus feared that merchants would raise their prices. To stop this, Alauddin controlled the prices of goods in Delhi. Prices were carefully surveyed by officers, and merchants who did not sell at the prescribed rates were punished. Muhammad Tughlaq also paid his soldiers cash salaries, but instead of controlling prices, he used a token currency somewhat like present day paper currency, but made out of cheap metals, not gold and silver. People in the 14th century did not trust these coins. They were very smart. They saved their gold and silver coins and paid all their taxes to the state with this token currency. This cheap currency could also be counterfeit easily. Alauddin's administrative measures were quite successful, and chroniclers praised his reign for its cheap prices and efficient supplies of goods in the market. He successfully withstood the threat of Mongol invasions. Muhammad Tughlaq's administrative measures were a failure. His campaign into Kashmir was a disaster. He then gave up his plans to invade Transoxiana and disbanded his large army. Meanwhile, his administrative measure created complications. The shifting of people to Daulatabad was resented. The raising of taxes and famine in the Ganga Yamuna belt led to widespread rebellion, and finally, the token currency had to be recalled. In this list of Muhammad Tughlaq's failures, we sometimes forget that for the first time in the history of the Sultanate, a Delhi Sultan planned a campaign to capture Mongol territory. Unlike Alauddin's defensive measures, Muhammad Tughlaq's measures were conceived as a part of a military offensive against the Mongols. The Sultanate in the 15th and 16th centuries. Take a look at Table 1 again. You will notice that after the Tughlaqs, the Sayyid and Lodi dynasties ruled from Delhi and Agra until 1526. By then, Jaunpur, Bengal, Malwa, Gujarat, Rajasthan, and the entire South India had independent rulers who established flourishing states and prosperous capitals. This was also the period which saw the emergence of new ruling groups like the Afghans and the Rajputs. Some of the states established in this period were small but powerful and extremely well administered. Sher Shah Sur 1540 to 1545 started his career as the manager of a small territory for his uncle in Bihar and eventually challenged and defeated the Mughal Emperor Humayun 1530 to 1540 and 1555 to 1556. Sher Shah captured Delhi and established his own dynasty. Although the Sur dynasty ruled for only 15 years, 1540 to 1555, it introduced an administration that borrowed elements from Alauddin Khilji and made them more efficient. Sher Shah's administration became the model followed by the great Emperor Akbar. 1556 to 1605 when he consolidated the Mughal Empire.